I want to start by telling you the story of a lady named Deet Eamon. Some of you know that name. Some of you have heard her story. Um, Deet Eamon was, I think I'm pronouncing that right. I'm going to do my best, okay? So Deet Eamon was born in Holland and grew up just before the Second World War. By the time the war rolled along, she was in her late teens. And she had met and fallen in love with another young man. His name was Hein. And they were beginning to think about their life together. They were beginning to think of marriage and family and settling down. And then the war broke out. And like many people living in Holland at the time, they saw the horrible things that the German army was doing. They were rounding up Jewish people and sending them off to concentration camps. And Deet and her husband, or fiance at the time, decided they couldn't stand by and do nothing. And so together they began to work with the Dutch underground, which meant that they were finding places for Jewish people and families to hide in homes and usually out in the country, hopefully far enough away from the German army that they wouldn't be found. And as the war dragged on and as the war and the German army grew in its persecution, it became harder and harder for Deet and Hein and all the people working with them to do their work. It became riskier. They had to steal ration cards and smuggle those into all these little farmhouses around Holland. They had to steal and forge identity papers, photos and documents and things, and they had to smuggle those out as well. They had to carry those on their person, so that the risk was that if they got caught with all these forged papers, they would almost certainly be executed or thrown in prison. So very risky. And sure enough, at one point, the worst happened. Deet Eamon was caught. She had all these papers in her satchel or whatever it was, and she was arrested and she was put in jail. And she was brought before the judge, and the judge listened to her story, and he said something like, "I know that what you're telling me is full of baloney, but I can't poke a hole in your story." So he put her back in jail. And that happened 2 or 3 times, I think. And then the third time, she was sent to one of the camps. And she would have been killed, except that the war ended about 2 weeks later. And so she was able to go free. She's living today. She's 95 years old. She lives in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And just last year, she attended the ballet in Grand Rapids with the King of Holland. And so she lives on, but her fiance did not. Her fiance, Hein, was killed in the war. And they were separated during the course of the war. They spent far more time apart than they ever did together because of the dangers of being caught together and so on. And so they were separated most of the war. But they exchanged letters back and forth. Had to do it really carefully, but they managed to do that. And one of the letters shed some light on why a person would take such risks. Because, think about it. What is it that would give a person that kind of courage and that kind of boldness to put your own life on the line, to put your own self in danger for complete strangers? What would make a person do that? Well, in one of these letters that Hein wrote to Deet, he said this. He said, "Darling, don't count on seeing each other again soon. Here we see again that we do not decide our own lives. Even if we won't see each other again on earth, we will never be sorry for what we did." One of the things you hear in just that little line, that little excerpt from the letter, is you hear an eternal perspective. Right? You hear they're not just looking at this life in the here and now and all the sufferings that go along with it, but they're seeing a vision of eternity, right? We might not see each other again in this life, and the implication being we will see each other again in eternity. And why do we do this? Why do we take these risks? Well, in eternity, we'll never be sorry for what we did. I don't know about you, but when I hear stories like that, I can't help but wondering to myself, if that was me, what would I do? How about you? I'll ask that of you. What would you do? If you were in that position, what would you do? Would you take the risk? If you have that boldness, or maybe to ask it just a little differently, what is it that gives us that kind of courage? What is it that helps us face the fire, face the adversity, face the suffering? How can we have that courage? How can we have that boldness and that confidence to face any kind of adversity that comes our way, even adversity that can cost us our life? Peter is writing in his letter, as I mentioned, he's writing to the early church. It was a church that was suffering immensely. Persecution, usually the kind of persecution we think of, the Christians being thrown to the lions and being, burned at the stake and that sort of thing. That was not yet full-fledged. It wasn't fully happening yet, but it was starting to. More and more hostility against the Christians, like the violent kind, was starting to pick up. But even before that, Christians were suffering greatly. Sometimes it would be great financial pressure. If you were a Christian business person, and people knew that you were a Christian, they would often ridicule you and make fun of you. They wouldn't do business with you. They wouldn't buy and sell from you. So it became really hard to make a living. Or in the public sphere, they would accuse the Christians of wanting to overthrow Rome. Christians wouldn't say with everyone else, Caesar is Lord. They wouldn't say that. They would say Jesus is Lord. They never tried to overthrow the government or anything. But when people heard Christians refusing to say Caesar is Lord and instead saying Jesus is Lord, they said, these Christians want a mutiny. They want to overthrow Rome. And the Christians suffered for that. They were ridiculed. They were mocked. They were, like I said, starting to be thrown in prison and put in jail and being even killed for it. Peter describes these there in verse 12. He says these are fiery trials. Fiery trial is not anything we ever seek out. Nobody wants to go through the fiery trial. Fiery trials are painful. They hurt. They can be extremely frightening if you're caught in the middle of it. Right? Fiery trials are miserable things. And that probably applies to any kind of suffering, any kind of adversity we face. Right? Fiery trials are painful. We don't want to go through that. But you know what? There's something else about fiery trials that Peter wants to draw out for us. And we know this because earlier in chapter 1 of this letter, in 1 Peter chapter 1, Peter has compared the adversity to a furnace. Not the kind that heats your house, but a kind that you'd use to purify gold or silver or any other kind of metal. You take the gold in its raw form, you put it in the furnace, you heat it up, it becomes molten, and then you can skim the crud off the top. All the dross and the impurities, they melt and they rise to the top, and so you can skim that off. Peter says that's what it's like for us to go through adversity. We're in the furnace. And when we're in the midst of adversity, when they're in the midst of the furnace, we find that our weaknesses are exposed. It might be a place in your life where you didn't realize it, but you aren't trusting in God as much as you thought you were. It might be an occasion where your joy is really in something other than in Christ. And you didn't know it, you didn't experience it in the moment, you didn't realize it, but when you're in the adversity, you begin to see that. It might be an occasion where you thought you were fully committed to following Jesus, and then you face an experience where you feel very torn. Your loyalty is very divided. Let me see if I can give you an example. Some of you are young men and women, 17, 18, 19 years old, high school, college age, and you're serious about your faith, which is just thank God for that. I see that in so many of our young men and women here. Now imagine you say, I want to follow Jesus and obey Him in everything. And then that young man or young woman, handsome or gorgeous, comes along, and there's a spark. There's some chemistry between you. So you go out on a date or two, you start to get to know each other, and there's no denying that you guys click. And then on that second or that third date, he says to you or she says to you, listen, I know you're into all that Jesus stuff, and that's fine for you. I'm not going to try to tell you differently. You can do that if you want, but I want no part of it, and I never will. You're in the furnace. Because you've made this claim all along. You've said, I believe in Jesus. He's more important to me than everything else. I want to follow him. I want to obey him. And it's easy to say that sometimes. But when you're forced to confront that divided loyalty, then you have to ask the question, now what am I going to do? Some of you, well, you're not teenagers. You're getting closer to retirement. And you have it in your mind, another 5 or 6 years, good hard work, keep investing, and by the time I get to be 65, 67, I can retire. And then you open your statement from your financial advisor, and you found that your retirement savings have shrunk dramatically. And now you think, I don't know how I can retire. See, it's one thing to say, I trust God to take care of me and to provide for all my needs. You can say that when retirement portfolio is doing well, your job is coming along nicely. But when you lose that, you're in the furnace. And you have to say, now, where do I really look for God's provision? Where am I really trusting God to take care of me? Maybe one more example. You get a new boss at work. Maybe you get promoted, you transfer to a different department. Your new boss is someone who's very outspoken against Christianity. They make fun of all those unenlightened things that Christians say and believe, and they even take opportunities to kind of poke fun at Christians. And now you're new on the scene. What do? Maybe there's an occasion that comes up and you have that choice to make. Do I actually acknowledge, yes, I believe in all that Christianity stuff? Or do you keep silent about it? That's the furnace moment. That's that moment. And those moments have a way of exposing to us our weaknesses sometimes, places where we're still growing in Christ, places where we say one thing but we're forced to actually act on it, and that's a whole different thing, isn't it? Those are fiery trials. They're not comfortable. They're painful often. They cause us angst and they cause us worry. But Peter wants us to see how we need to respond to those. What does he say? Well, first of all, he says in verse 12, don't be surprised. Don't be surprised that you're going through this. Don't be surprised at the painful trials, the fiery trials that you're going through. Don't be surprised. Now, why would Peter say that? Well, surprise, if you think of it, surprise says, this shouldn't be happening to me. It catches you off guard. I shouldn't be going through this right now. And it's possible that on one level in your heart or your mind, you say, I've been a good person. I've prayed every day. I've read my Bible. I've gone to church all the time. This shouldn't be coming to my way. I shouldn't have to go through this kind of suffering and pain. That's a kind of surprise. It says that deep down, it says good things or bad things shouldn't happen to good people. Or to put it a little bit differently, you might be one of these folks, and I think maybe all of us have a tendency to do this. You look out there at the world around and you just lament the way everything is going. You say, look at how bad it is out there for Christians, and the world hates Christians, and I just can't believe what this world is coming to. That's a surprise of a different sort, isn't it? I mean, it's sort of a cynicism, and it's a surprise or it's a cynicism or an approach that says, I didn't think sin was really this bad. I didn't think the world was as broken or as fallen as it is, and it catches you off guard. And Peter says, don't be surprised by that. Don't be surprised. Why? Because number one, sin is far more pervasive than we often care to admit. Right? So don't be surprised. The world is a fallen, sinful, broken world. And that sin is very pervasive. But number two, look at Jesus. Jesus turns that idea of good people don't deserve suffering, he turns that completely on its head, doesn't he? Because Jesus lived the life of absolute perfection in every way. If there's ever anyone who could have said, I don't deserve to suffer, it would have been Jesus. And yet Jesus suffered more than any of us ever will. So that idea, good people don't suffer, Jesus shows that that's just a myth. In fact, Jesus actually says to us, if you come and follow me, you can expect hardship. You can expect adversity. They made fun of me, says Jesus. They made fun of the prophets. Everyone who comes after me can expect to be insulted, persecuted, made fun of, rejected. Right? Jesus says you can plan on it. You can expect it. So don't be surprised. But instead, in verses 13 and 14, Peter says, rejoice. Rejoice in your suffering. How in the world can you rejoice? In pain, in sickness, in loss, in uncertainty. How in the world can we rejoice? Peter shows us two ways. Look at verse 13. Rejoice that you participate in the sufferings of Christ. Do you realize that if you are hurting today, and some of you are going through the furnace today, do you realize that Jesus isn't calling you to go anywhere that he hasn't gone first? Do you know that you are sharing in the adversity and the pain that Jesus himself experienced? Jesus knows exactly what you are going through. He knows the fear, he knows the pain, he knows the hardship. If you have ever been made fun of publicly, workplace, at school, because of your Christian faith, you can remember that Jesus was made fun of too. People laughed at him all the time. And I think it helps us know that in our moments of suffering, our moments of rejection, pain, we're drawing closer to the experience of Jesus. We're experiencing what he did. We're sharing in his sufferings. And then look at verse 14. Peter goes on and says, not 14, second part of 13. Rejoice as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. Did you catch how Peter says that? Rejoice now, and you'll be overjoyed later. Rejoice now, and you will be overjoyed at the glory that is being revealed. If you're experiencing pain today, adversity, suffering, or if you're going to experience it this week, this month, this year, or sometime in the future, it'll come to all of us. Know this. Jesus is working in you something that is for his infinitely greater glory. He's working out something in the midst of your pain and adversity that may not be revealed until Jesus comes back. But he is working out a purpose of perfecting you and working out his glory in your life. Jesus is taking that pain, he's taking that hardship, he's taking that adversity, and he is doing something glorious with it. He's doing something absolutely splendor-filled with it. Now, please don't understand that as a nice, neat little Band-Aid solution. It's not to downplay the pain that you may be feeling. It's to say you can look ahead to how God uses suffering to bring about great glory. If not in this moment now, then certainly in eternity. So rejoice, and you will be overjoyed. Now I want you to know that Peter isn't writing from an ivory tower. And that's really important to know, isn't it? Because I don't know about you, if you've gone through a hard time and someone comes along and they say, oh, I know what you're going through. I know how you feel. I know what you're experiencing. And in the back of your mind, you're thinking to yourself, you know what? This person has not known pain even more than a hangnail. How can they possibly know? And then everything they have to say after that just doesn't mean much to you because they haven't experienced it. Well, I want you to know that Peter himself has experienced this. He can speak to us. And God can speak to us through Peter because Peter has lived this. Peter was one of the early apostles of the church, one of the early leaders. And as the church was just getting going, great hostility from the religious folks began to break out against the Christians. And Peter bore the brunt of that. He was arrested. He was thrown in jail. He was beaten. He was put on trial. He was told, don't you ever speak about Jesus again. And then, on this one occasion at least, Peter is let out of prison. And he says something says something then that sounds like what he says here. He says, we considered it a joy and a privilege to be counted worthy of suffering for the name of Christ. Peter considered it an honor to suffer. He didn't become bitter. He didn't become cynical. He considered it an honor to suffer for the name of Christ. And that was the attitude of many, many, many of the early believers. Now, what does Peter say to us about that? How do we handle that then? What are we supposed to do? Peter says, count it an honor, and then he moves into this section in verses 17 and 18. He talks about judgment that will come to the family of God first. And that's a little puzzling. That seems like it almost doesn't quite fit with the rest of this text. What is Peter getting at here? Well, he's quoting the prophets, first of all. That's important to know. He's quoting, particularly, he's not directly quoting them, but he's certainly alluding to a text that's found in the book of Ezekiel. And the same idea is found in a number of the other prophets. Ezekiel the prophet comes to the Israelites, and he says to them, you know, you Israelites, you're always looking out at the world out there. And you're seeing all the problems in the world out there, and you're saying one day God is going to get you all. Right? It was an idea. The people of Israel looked for judgment on the nations. And Ezekiel and other Old Testament prophets came along and said, pay attention. Because God is going to deal with his own house first. God is going to deal with his own people before he deals with the nations of the world. Now, what does that mean for us today? What does that mean in our context? Well, one way to understand this is to see what God is doing with his church today as a way of dealing first with his church. In other words, we like to look out there at the world and we see all that's wrong with the world, and God says, I need to also deal with my own people. I need to deal with my own church. Statistics will tell us that the number of people who are serious and committed to Jesus Christ is shrinking pretty dramatically today in the United States. And we're seeing a growing number of people who claim no religious affiliation whatsoever. Right? You've seen those statistics, and it seems to be backed up by experience. There are a lot of different ways to look at that. One way is kind of get cynical. You know, the world is falling apart and church is falling apart. And I wonder if maybe the better way to look at that and to understand that is to see that God is actually strengthening his church. Now hear me out on that. As the tide turns against Christianity, and as it becomes harder and harder to stand in the public square and profess Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and as it becomes harder and harder to live out Christian convictions and Christian morals, the number of people who will be willing to do that is going down, down, down. But the people who are willing to do it are becoming more and more convicted that they must live this out. So in other words, God is strengthening his church by shrinking it. By letting the people who are not willing to commit fully to what it means to follow Jesus Christ in every area of life. Right? That number is shrinking. God is dealing with his church, perhaps. And I want to be careful with that. I want to be careful just by making flat-out, airtight statements. So hear me being cautious here. But I want to raise this as maybe what Peter is getting at here. We're not going to have it easy in this world. The church is not going to be spared from some of the adversity and some of the hardship. But what does Peter say to us? How do we live in this context where even the church is not spared from this adversity, even from within itself? Well, Peter says a couple things. Look at verse 19. He says, those who suffer according to God's will should commit themselves to their faithful Creator and continue to do good. Two parts to that. Let's take them in reverse order. Continue to do good. Please don't let the way things are going today in the church or in the world, please don't let that make you bitter. Please don't let that make you cynical. Don't look around at the way things are and say this world is all falling apart and nothing can be done, and throw up your hands in despair. Commit to doing good. Find a way to love your neighbor. Find a way to show the love of Christ to your community. Find a way to engage this world with the presence of Jesus. Peter says to the church, don't ever let the way things are in this hostile world pull you away from doing good. In fact, just the opposite. The church in the early centuries had a wide and well-known reputation for being people who went above and beyond to do good to those who least deserved it. And it was one of these things that had the leaders and the powers that be completely and utterly perplexed and befuddled. They couldn't figure out, why are these Christians so adamant about caring for the least of the people? It's a powerful witness to the Christian faith. Commit to doing good. And commit yourself to God. Commit yourselves to God. Peter is echoing the words of Jesus himself here. You remember when Jesus is on the cross. He's experiencing hardship and suffering and persecution in its most intense form. And do you remember one of the things Jesus said from the cross? He said, in the midst of that suffering, he didn't turn and blame God. He certainly lamented. He certainly cried out. But then he said, into your hands I commit my spirit. In other words, I trust myself to you even in this great suffering and pain and adversity and spiritual aloneness. I trust myself to the care of my Father in heaven. Jesus entrusted his soul to God in the midst of the most severe judgment because he knew that what God was doing in the midst of that suffering and pain was accomplishing his redemptive purposes. God was accomplishing his plan not in spite of suffering, but through suffering. So he says, I can trust myself into the care of God. And you know what that means for us? It means that because Jesus has experienced the judgment of God, we can know that we will never experience God's judgment. And so when we experience any kind of adversity or affliction or pain or suffering, it's not because God is judging us. But rather we can know that we can entrust ourselves to God knowing that God will use that experience to refine us and to discipline us and to perfect us and to purify us in the midst of the furnace. God will use every trial not to punish us but to perfect us. Some of you know J.I. Packer. You know the name. Packer is a theologian and a churchman and a professor, and he's had a wonderful influence on the church in the last probably 40 years or more. For the last 10 years or so, he's been suffering from macular degeneration in one of his eyes. So he's been losing sight. And when you're someone who still writes all your notes with ballpoint pen and paper, that's harder and harder to do when you're losing sight. But he's still done it. He's still traveled. He's still taught. Well, a couple weeks ago, in fact, over Christmas, he realized he was losing his sight very quickly in the other eye. So he was going blind. And so he announced just last week, actually, that he was ending his public ministry. He can't travel anymore. He can't write. And someone look at that and first of all say, what great adversity, right? What an affliction. And it is. How do you handle that? Well, Packer, through his publisher, he said this. God knows what he's doing. And some good, something for his glory is going to come out of it. I find it more possible to concentrate on God himself and his plans, purposes, and performance than I used to. Does a guy like Packer know everything God is doing?